in Mago Reddit. Today's story is...
My distant aunt, who barely spoke to me, left me her entire $1 million fortune. But the secret reason behind her decision caused my parents to completely lose control. I never paid much attention to my Aunt Lydia. As my mother's older sister, she was always present in the background of my existence, but we never developed a close bond. My parents described her as the eccentric figure of the family, independent, unique, and stubbornly self-sufficient. During my childhood, our encounters were limited to a few family reunions. She showed no warmth or particular affection, although she wasn't unpleasant either. According to my parents, she had always shown them preference, giving them expensive gifts and supporting them when they needed it. They spoke of her as if they were assured of her complete devotion. That's why when Aunt Lydia passed away last month, I didn't expect to be significantly involved. I assumed that my parents would take care of everything that needed to be done, and, as usual, they would brag about the inheritance they would receive. I didn't even attend the funeral. It was held in another state, and I couldn't afford to take time off work or cover the travel expenses. To be honest, I didn't feel much sadness. How could I, when she always kept herself so distant? Imagine my astonishment when I received the letter from her lawyer a week later. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The thick envelope with the official stamp was addressed to me. I opened it hesitantly, quickly scanning the legal terms until my eyes stopped at the fragment that made my stomach turn. Aunt Lydia had bequeathed me her entire inheritance, her entire estate. I reread the words over and over again, unable to accept it. There must have been some misunderstanding. Why would she leave anything to me? And certainly not all her assets. I was simply her niece, someone she barely recognized. I wasn't even an active part of her life. The only people close to her, if they could be considered as such, were my parents. I called the lawyer immediately to clarify the situation. He confirmed it without hesitation. My aunt had updated her will 5 years earlier, naming me as the sole beneficiary. She owned assets valued at a small fortune, a house that was paid for in full, considerable savings, investments, and several personal items of significant value. He explained that she had left specific instructions for me to take my time and decide what to do with everything, but ultimately it belonged to me. For a moment, I was paralyzed. This kind of thing doesn't happen to people like me. I was a 28-year-old struggling to survive, working 2 part-time jobs just to keep my head above water. My parents had never given me financial or emotional support. I spent most of my life feeling like an afterthought in my own family. Suddenly, I was holding a lifeline in my hands, one that could transform everything. The euphoria didn't last long. My parents found out almost immediately. It started with a phone call from my mother. She sounded cheerful and almost jubilant, asking me how I was and if I had received any interesting news lately. I knew she was already informed, I could tell from her tone. I replied cautiously, admitting that I had received correspondence from Aunt Lydia's lawyer. Her reaction was instantaneous. She laughed, commenting that it was about time Aunt Lydia got her affairs in order. She asked me how much the inheritance was worth, assuming in advance that I had no right to claim it. And when I hesitated, she insisted more firmly. Her voice became harsh. She demanded to know what the lawyer had told me. I revealed the truth. There was silence on the other end of the line, and then it erupted. He accused me of lying, of trying to swindle the family out of what was rightfully theirs. My father was shouting in the background, his voice muffled but furious. They both railed about how Aunt Lydia would never have done such a thing, how it must be a mistake, and how I had no right to keep money that belonged to them. "She was our sister, not yours," my mother blurted out, her voice trembling with indignation. "You have no right to her inheritance. She only left it to you because you somehow manipulated her. You'd better do the right thing and hand it over. Family comes first." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Manipulated? I barely communicated with Aunt Lydia. I reminded my mother of that, but she showed no interest in logic. She kept repeating that it was unfair, that Aunt Lydia must have been confused when she wrote the will, and that I was obliged to correct this injustice. The following days were a whirlwind of phone calls, text messages, and even a surprise visit from my parents. They weren't just annoyed, they were furious. My father demanded that I hand over the inheritance immediately, claiming that it was his birthright. He repeatedly mentioned how much they had worked to raise me, how much they had sacrificed, and how ungrateful I was for even considering keeping the money. I tried to stay calm, but their constant harassment was exhausting. Every time I stood my ground, they intensified the guilt. They claimed that I was destroying the family, that I was acting out of greed, and that I would regret it if I didn't do the right thing. At one point, my father declared, "You think this money belongs to you, but it doesn't. It's ours. She was our sister, not yours. What would people think if they knew you were stealing from your own parents?" I was stunned. "Rob?" The nerve was almost laughable, but there was nothing funny about how they were treating me. For the first time, I perceived how arrogant and manipulative they could be. Not having the strength to continue arguing, I told them that I needed time to reflect. That did not satisfy them, but it was the only way to get them to leave my apartment. After they left, I sat down and cried, not because I felt guilty, because I wasn't, but because I realized how little they valued me as a person. This inheritance wasn't just about money. It was an opportunity for me to live a stable life. No matter how hard they tried to make me feel guilty, I wasn't going to let them take it away from me. As I wiped away my tears and took a deep breath, I made a decision. If they thought they could intimidate and subdue me, they were about to find out how wrong they were. Update 1. The next morning, I woke up to dozens of missed calls and text messages from my parents. My mother had even left several voicemails, each one more dramatic than the last. In one, she was sobbing, saying she couldn't believe how she was betraying the family. In another, her voice sounded cold and cutting, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. My father had left a shorter but angrier message, threatening to get lawyers involved if this wasn't sorted out. I ignored it all. Instead, I concentrated on contacting Aunt Lydia's lawyer again. I needed to understand exactly what I was facing before the situation escalated any further. The lawyer, Mr. Clark, was patient and professional, explaining everything to me in detail. Aunt Lydia's will was indisputable, and she had left clear instructions about her intentions. She wanted me, and only me, to inherit her estate. When I asked him why she had chosen me, he hesitated before answering. He said that Aunt Lydia had spoken very favorably of me in their meetings, describing me as hardworking and kind. Apparently, she had been following my development closely over the years, even though we hadn't had a close relationship. I was stunned. All those times I thought she was distant and indifferent, she had actually been paying attention. Mr. Clark added that Aunt Lydia had been disappointed by the treatment she received from my parents. She considered them to be arrogant and contemptuous, and did not appreciate the sacrifices she had made to support me. It was a lot to take in. I had spent my whole life feeling ignored and undervalued, but here was someone who had silently observed my difficulties and wanted to make a difference. This thought brought tears to my eyes. After the conversation, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Aunt Lydia had chosen me for a reason, and I would not allow my parents to intimidate me into giving up their legacy, but confronting them would not be easy. That afternoon, I received another knock on my door. This time, it was my older cousin, Sarah, whom I hadn't seen in years. She was my parents' favorite niece, and had always been their model child. Growing up, I was constantly compared to her, how attractive she was, how intelligent and successful. I wasn't surprised that they sent her to talk to me. Sarah didn't waste any time getting to the point. She mentioned that she had heard about Aunt Lydia's will and wanted to help me see reason. She said that my parents were devastated and that I was being cruel in refusing to share the inheritance with them. She said that my mother had been crying incessantly. My father was losing sleep over the betrayal. Then she leaned forward, her tone dripping with condescension, and said that it wasn't too late to put things right. "You have to understand," Sarah said to me. "Aunt Lydia must have been confused. She probably didn't realize the tension this would create in the family. You don't want to be the cause of a permanent rift, do you?" I couldn't help but laugh. I asked her if my parents had ever considered how their behavior might have affected me. Did they reflect on the rift they created when they constantly belittled me, ignored my needs, and made me feel insignificant? Sarah seemed uncomfortable but persisted. She said I was being overly emotional and needed to think logically. She even suggested that I give my parents a reasonable portion of the inheritance to keep the peace. It was infuriating. She was treating me like a child incapable of understanding the consequences of my actions, when in fact I understood them all too well. My parents had spent years undermining my confidence, making me feel insignificant, and now they wanted me to give up the only thing that could finally give me some independence. I told Sarah that I wasn't interested in negotiating. Aunt Lydia's will was clear, and I had no intention of going against her wishes. If my parents had any objections, they could take it up with the lawyer. Sarah left muttering something about how I was making a big mistake. I didn't care. The following days passed disturbingly calmly. My parents stopped calling and sending messages, and for a moment I thought they might have given up, but intuitively I knew that wasn't the case. And sure enough, the calm didn't last long. One morning, I woke up to an avalanche of notifications on my phone. My mother had posted an extensive emotional diatribe on Facebook, accusing me of stealing the inheritance and tearing the family apart. She presented herself as a victim, claiming that Aunt Lydia suffered from mental instability when she wrote the will, and that I was taking advantage of her confusion. The post contained numerous lies, but that didn't matter. My parents' friends and extended family members immediately came to my defense, flooding the comments with messages of support. They called me greedy, selfish, and heartless, proclaiming that I was betraying my own parents for money. It was humiliating. I hadn't even told most people about the inheritance, and now my personal affairs were being publicly exposed. Initially, I experienced a wave of panic. I didn't know how to respond or if I should respond at all. But as I read the comments, something changed. These people didn't know me. They were unaware of the sacrifices I had made to survive or the years of emotional neglect I had endured from my parents. They were judging me based on a one-sided narrative, and I realized that I didn't owe them anything. Not an explanation, not an apology, absolutely nothing. Instead of interacting with the publication, I contacted Mr. Clark again. I told him about the situation and asked for his advice. He assured me that my parents had no legal right to the inheritance, regardless of the scandal they caused. He also suggested that I document everything, every call, message, and visit, in case they tried to escalate the situation further. His calm and practical approach helped me to focus. I couldn't control what my parents said or did, but I could control how I responded. I decided to block my mother on Facebook and set my profile to private. I also contacted some close friends to let them know what was happening, so they wouldn't be taken by surprise by the drama. Their support meant a lot to me. The next time my parents tried to contact me, I was ready. I didn't answer their calls, but I sent them a message indicating that any further communication should be channeled through Mr. Clark. They didn't take it positively. My father sent an angry reply accusing me of being disrespectful and threatening to exclude me from the family. My mother followed up with a tearful voicemail, begging me to reconsider, but I was not willing to give in. I was in control. Update 2. The fallout from my mother's Facebook tirade quickly escalated. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years contacted me to ask what had happened, while distant relatives joined the controversy to either criticize or support me. On reflection, I realized that this was exactly what my parents wanted: control through humiliation. I refused to give them the satisfaction. After consulting with Mr. Clark, we decided to take action. He proposed to file a defamation lawsuit against my parents, considering the obvious falsehoods they had spread online. It was not about the financial aspect. Aunt Lydia's inheritance had left me more than secure, but about setting limits and making it clear that they could not intimidate me into submission. When I gave him authorization, Mr. Clark acted swiftly. A formal notification was sent to my parents, detailing the defamatory statements made and demanding a public retraction and apology. If they refused, we would proceed with legal action. Predictably, my parents reacted with fury. My mother called me hysterically, ranting about how I was destroying the family. My father left a scathing voicemail, accusing me of insensitivity and warning that I would regret my actions. I did not respond to either. Then came the pleas. Days later, Sarah turned up unexpectedly at my door, her usual confident demeanor replaced by nervousness. She tried to guilt me, claiming that suing my parents was crossing a line and that I should consider how this affected their health. I was not moved. I told her that if they were really concerned about her well-being, they should have thought about the consequences of their actions before spreading lies about me on the internet. Sarah did not like that answer. She changed her strategy, claiming that I was exaggerating that the family could resolve this privately. She even proposed to get my parents to apologize to me personally instead of subjecting them to public humiliation. I laughed bitterly and told her it was too late. For years, they had treated me as an afterthought, dismissing my feelings and prioritizing their own desires. Now they were finally facing the consequences of their behavior, and I had no intention of giving in. When Sarah realized that I would not be defeated, she made one last desperate attempt. She mentioned Aunt Lydia, suggesting that my aunt would not have wanted this kind of family conflict. I interrupted her, reminding her that Aunt Lydia had bequeathed her fortune to me for a reason. I would not allow anyone to disrespect her memory by turning her last wishes into a bargaining chip. The next day, Mr. Clark informed me that my parents wanted to reach an agreement. They had recognized that they lacked a solid defense and were eager to avoid the embarrassment of litigation. I had hoped they would negotiate, but they accepted Mr. Clark's conditions without much resistance. The terms were simple. They had to issue a public apology on social media, retracting their false statements and acknowledging the damage caused. Additionally, they would pay me $4,000 in damages, not because I needed the money, but as a symbolic gesture demonstrating that their actions had consequences. But I wasn't finished. I told Mr. Clark that I had an additional condition. If Sarah intended to act as a mediator, she could start by apologizing to me personally, and I didn't want a superficial apology. I wanted her to get on her knees. Mr. Clark was surprised but agreed to include the demand in the agreement. My reasoning was simple. Sarah had spent years harassing me, making derogatory comments about my appearance, my choices, and my achievements. She had always been my parents' favorite child, despite being only their niece, enjoying their praise while I was treated like an outsider. If she wanted to defend them with such passion, she could show me the same level of humility that they were being forced to exhibit. When Sarah heard about my demand, she was furious. She called me, ranting about the humiliation it would entail, accusing me of being vindictive. I told her that she was free to refuse if she didn't want to apologize, but that I wouldn't go ahead with the agreement. If she intended to meddle in my life and ally herself with my parents, she needed to understand that her actions also had consequences. Finally, he agreed. The apology took place a week later in my lawyer's office, and my parents looked defeated as they handed me the signed settlement agreement. My mother's eyes were red from crying, and my father avoided eye contact. Mr. Clark looked over the documents to make sure everything was in order before nodding to me. Sarah stood to one side, arms firmly crossed over her chest. She seemed to want to be anywhere but there. When it was her turn, she hesitated momentarily, looking to my parents for support. My father gave her a small nod, and she reluctantly stepped forward. I motioned for her to kneel. Her face flushed with anger, but she did not object. Slowly, she descended to the floor, her eyes burning with resentment. She mumbled an apology, her voice barely audible. I asked her to speak up, and she repeated herself, louder this time, saying that she regretted the way she had treated me and for siding with my parents. He admitted that his actions had been hurtful and that he had been wrong to dismiss my feelings. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. For the first time, I was not the one who was belittled or dismissed, and for the first time, I held the power. Once the apology was over, I stood up and left without looking back. I didn't need to hear his excuses or justifications. I had spent my whole life trying to win their approval, but now I understood that their opinions were irrelevant. The important thing was that I had finally stood up for myself. The public apology appeared on my parents' social media accounts later that day. It was carefully worded, no doubt with the assistance of their lawyer, but it was enough to rehabilitate my reputation. They admitted to spreading false information and acknowledged that their actions had harmed me. The $4,000 settlement was deposited into my account shortly afterwards. It was insignificant compared to Aunt Lydia's inheritance, but it wasn't about the money. It was about showing that I would no longer tolerate intimidation. As for Sarah, she avoided me after the apology. I knew from relatives that she felt ashamed about the whole thing, but I wasn't worried. I had participated in my parents' toxic behavior for years, and it was time for me to face the consequences. With the legal conflict behind me, I finally felt a sense of peace. Aunt Lydia's inheritance had provided me with more than financial security. It had given me the strength to stand up for myself and demand the respect I deserved. Update 3. When Aunt Lydia bequeathed me her entire fortune, it wasn't just about money, it was about trust. She believed in me to do the right thing, to use her legacy in a meaningful way. I did not take that lightly. Aunt Lydia had been an eccentric, fiercely independent woman who valued integrity, loyalty, and family, qualities that my parents never seemed to understand. I wanted to honor her in a way that reflected her identity and her principles. Initially, I was unsure how to proceed. The figures were intimidating. While some of the money remained tied up in investments, I still had an impressive amount. I had no intention of wasting it on frivolous luxuries. Aunt Lydia would not have approved, and besides, it didn't seem right. I had spent so many years scrimping and saving, carefully budgeting every penny, that the idea of reckless spending made me uncomfortable. One of my first actions was to secure my own future. I paid off all my debts, including student loans, credit cards, and the small mortgage on my modest home. Knowing that I was financially free was a huge relief. I also set up a substantial emergency fund, ensuring that I would never have to worry about unforeseen expenses again. I then turned my attention to Aunt Lydia's residence. Her sprawling Victorian property had been the center of her existence. It was in need of major repairs and renovations, but she couldn't bear the thought of selling it or allowing it to deteriorate. I hired a team of professionals to restore it to its former glory, but I understood that this legacy did not concern me alone. Aunt Lydia's life had been one of quiet generosity, Mr. Clark informed me. She had always contributed to the best of her ability, whether it was donating to local food banks, supporting women's shelters, or funding educational programs, and continuing that legacy seemed to me the most natural and meaningful way to honor her. I also made donations to charities that Aunt Lydia had supported during her lifetime. Local food banks received generous contributions, ensuring that families in need did not go hungry. Women's shelters were provided with much-needed funds to offer resources, counseling, and safe spaces for survivors of domestic violence. One of the more personal donations went to a literacy program that helped adults learn to read. Aunt Lydia had volunteered there for years, and I remembered the passion with which she spoke about the joy of witnessing someone discover the world through books for the first time. Donating in her name seemed like a way to come full circle with something she had loved. When the news spread about the destination of Aunt Lydia's fortune, I was not surprised to hear from my parents again. Their sense of entitlement was boundless, and they would not allow the inheritance to escape without exploring all possibilities. On this occasion, they employed a new strategy. They sent relatives as intermediaries. It began with a voice message from an aunt with whom she barely spoke, even at festive times. Her tone was brimming with false cordiality as she commented on how proud Aunt Lydia would be of the donations made. Then came the twist. My parents had mentioned that they were experiencing financial difficulties, she added. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could extend some of Aunt Lydia's generosity to them? How absurd. Financial difficulties? Who were they trying to fool? I didn't reply. The next day, a cousin I hadn't seen since I was a teenager sent me a long message. She recalled when Aunt Lydia took us for ice cream and then subtly steered the conversation towards how my parents were going through difficult times. According to her, it would be fair for her to help them since they were still family. I contemplated the message at length before deleting it. If these people thought they could guilt me into handing over money, they were about to be sorely disappointed. What really outraged me, however, was how they tried to use the concept of family as a weapon against me. Where did that sense of family lie when I was growing up being ignored and dismissed by my parents? Where was it when I had to fend for myself? While my cousin Sarah was pampered and spoiled, now that I possessed something they coveted, suddenly I was family again? But not all my relatives behaved identically. Some cousins, like my father's niece Sophia, had always been kind to me. Observing Sophia's struggle to pay for her nursing studies, I decided to offer her support. I contacted her directly, and we had a conversation. At first she hesitated, but when I assured her that it was Aunt Lydia's money and not my parents', she gratefully accepted. Sophia wasn't the only one. I also helped my cousin Marcus, who had always stood up for me during our childhood, pay his tuition at technical school. Both expressed sincere gratitude, and witnessing their enthusiasm and relief made me feel that I was doing something meaningful with the inheritance. Naturally, my parents found out that I was helping Sophia and Marcus, and the calls and messages started up again. My mother left a voicemail. I could hear the tremor in her voice as she said she couldn't believe I was giving money to cousins while my own parents were struggling. She accused me of selfishness and ingratitude, and of disrespecting those who had raised me. My father's message was even more direct. He demanded to know why I was helping distant relatives instead of supporting my immediate family. I didn't bother to reply to either of them. Their persistence didn't stop. They started sending me messages every day, alternating between guilt-tripping me and insulting me directly. My mother claimed that Aunt Lydia would have been ashamed of how I treated them. My father declared that I was an insensitive daughter who would regret abandoning her family. It was laughable, really. These same people had ignored me all my life. They had backed Sarah even when she harassed me incessantly, and they only considered me as an emergency resource when they needed something. They had the audacity to call me heartless. Eventually, they escalated the situation. My father called me one night, his voice brimming with anger. He said that if I didn't start supporting them financially, they would have no choice but to reveal to everyone what an ungrateful and cruel person I was. I asked him how the new country house they had recently bought was. He stopped in the middle of his rant. He stammered. I informed him that I would get back to my lawyer and ended the call. That was the last straw. I contacted my lawyer the following morning and explained the situation. I told him about the constant calls, the messages, and how my parents were trying to get money from relatives. He listened patiently and then assured me that he would take care of the matter. Within a week, my lawyer had sent a formal warning to my parents. The letter detailed how their repeated attempts to harass me were unacceptable and that any further contact would result in legal action. It was clear and firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I received no direct communication from them afterwards, but my aunt called me days later, furious. She declared that I had overstepped the mark by threatening legal action against my own parents. I calmly explained that I had no obligation to tolerate harassment, even from family members, if they did not respect my boundaries, and that I had every right to protect myself. I asked her if she wanted to be next. My parents finally gave in, but not without one last attempt to present themselves as victims. They posted an ambiguous message on social media about how ungrateful children forget the sacrifices made by their parents. They hadn't learned their lesson. Some relatives intervened with sympathetic comments, but others who knew the truth defended me. Sophia even commented, saying that Aunt Lydia had clearly expressed her wishes and that I was honoring her memory in the best possible way. Seeing her defend me moved me to tears. In the end, my parents' stratagems did not prosper. They did not manage to manipulate me to obtain what they craved, nor did they manage to damage my reputation among those who really mattered. At last, I enjoyed peace and freedom to live on my own terms, without their toxic influence weighing me down.